Today we're going to talk about dumpers and if they hurt after a breakup too. Now, many who watch this YouTube channel, they have a tendency to demonize dumpers and call them evil or say something along the lines of, they never loved me, they don't care about me, they're selfish. And it may seem cold if they seem like they don't care, but our research has found that isn't entirely true. Dumpers do hurt, just like dumpees, but they have a different way of processing the grief than many of our dumpy clients. And because they view relationships in a different way fundamentally. And so in this video, I'd really like to show you why so many people mislabel dumpers after a breakup and hopefully give you insight to help you in your potential breakup that you're going through right now, or future ones that you go through, or just past breakups. I think it really starts with understanding the avoidant stages of grief. Now, you may be familiar with the 5 stages of grief. You have denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Now, I've found that the stages of grief tend to be pretty accurate for most of the clients that we take on here at Ex-Boyfriend Recovery and Ex-Girlfriend Recovery. But there's one small change. Often our clients will have setbacks or skip entire stages. In other words, they're processing their grief out of order. And I'd say that close to 90% of our clients are actually the dumpees, which means that the exes they so desperately want back are the dumpers. Now, one of the observations I've had when it comes to dumpees is that they really don't go through the typical stages of grief. Rather, most of them process breakups in the same way an avoidant will. So my team and I think that this is because most of our clients are dealing with exes who are avoidant. In fact, a recent poll in our private Facebook support group showed that over 70% of our clients believe that their exes, the dumpers, are avoidant. Now, for those of you who don't know what an avoidant is, I think our very own coach Tyler Ramsey gives an amazing description. So he really talked about in a recent interview that we did that the avoidant attachment style is essentially a person that does not like a lot of emotional intimacy or vulnerability within a relationship. So typically they're going to revert a conversation back to someone else to talk about themselves as an effort to avoid the spotlight. Now, often that's how you'll figure out if they're an avoidant or not. Ultimately, they're afraid of having a deeper emotional connection, and it can all stem from their experience in childhood. They've learned that anytime they are vulnerable, it can be used against them, and therefore they don't rely on other people. Now, one of the points that I made in an article is that a quick way to understand if you're dealing with an avoidant is to actually look at the avoidance core wound. Now, an avoidance core wound is comically simple. They simply don't want to lose independence in the relationship. Ultimately, this is why we see so many breakups stemming from independence loss events. So like an example of this is a lot of times we're noticing breakups happen at these tipping points, and usually the tipping points revolve around major life changes or major relationship changes. Sometimes even getting into a relationship is enough for the avoidant to feel like their independence is being threatened, and then they'll leave. Sometimes it can be going out and looking for rings. Sometimes it could be moving in together. Sometimes it could be having a child together. All sorts of things can set the avoidant off, and always it has to do with a loss of independence. They're losing their independence. I think using a child is a great example of this. They feel like even though they love the child, the fact that they're having the child with you means they're going to lose all the free time they get. And as a result, they run away from the relationship. Not exactly the most mature response, but a great example to show us, a really horrible example actually, but a great example to show us this independence core wound concept. Now, what's interesting is the avoidant processes grief in a much different way than you would probably expect. So one of my favorite go-to websites recently is called freetoattach.com. I highly recommend that you check that out if you're interested in learning more about how avoidants operate. Sometimes the information get a little dry, but for the most part, it is top notch. And one of the things that I think Free to Attach really does a great job of is highlighting the fundamental difference in how avoidants handle breakups compared to the average person. So while you can expect the average person to handle a breakup utilizing the 5 stages of grief, the avoidant X will have a completely different approach. They're going to be handling breakups through the 5 stages of avoidant grief. And those 5 stages are Euphoria, Repression, Rebound, Depression, and Nostalgia. Now, before I dive into the 5 stages, one of the things that I really want to make clear is not every single dumper is going to be an avoidant. The reason I'm spending so much of my time here focusing on avoidance is because our polling research has indicated that most of the people listening to this are probably going to be having avoidant dumper exes. So I think the shoe kind of fits. take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt. It may not describe your ex perfectly, but it will describe a lot of exes in the general sphere. So let's look at stage 1. Stage 1 of the avoidant stages of grief is called Euphoria. Now, according to freetoattach.com, my favorite avoidant website, after a relationship ends, people with an avoidant attachment style tend not to show much anxiety or distress, often feeling an initial sense of relief at relinquishing the obligations and the sense that they are regaining their self-identity. There's that self-identity independence thing again. So remember how I said a lot of the avoidance identity is wrapped up into the idea of independence? Well, initially the avoidant upon the outset of a breakup is going to feel this euphoria because to them it's going to feel like they've reclaimed their identity. And this is often the stage where many people make the assumptions about the avoidant. It can seem like they never cared about you. It can seem like you meant nothing to them. And simply they're thinking this, or simply you're potentially thinking this because the avoidant is really over the moon about the breakup. But the stage doesn't last forever because repression is right around the corner. And that's stage number 2, repression. So eventually, after the initial elation of getting their independence back wears off, grief starts to hit them. They start remembering the good times or the bad times. Either way, it hurts to remember. Now, when those feelings begin to bubble to the surface, they repress them. After all, avoidants are considered experts in regulating their emotions. They're considered experts at having a lifetime of practice of repressing their emotions. And this might be the single hardest stage to identify from the outside because it's all internal for them. So with stage 1, they can be overly obnoxious on social media about how happy they are after a breakup. But with stage 2, with repression, it's more of an internal battle that they're undergoing alone. Many times you're not even seeing them go through it, but it is happening. And that leads us to stage 3, rebound. So one of my favorite movies, Jurassic Park, is most known for the phrase, life finds a way. Now, the meaning is clear. No matter how hard you try to suppress life, it's going to find a way to succeed. Now, the same sentiment can be had about feelings. No matter how hard a dumper tries to suppress feelings about the breakup, they're going to come to the surface, and they will always find a way to keep occurring. So, with them losing this internal battle, they decide to do something more drastic. They're going to use another person to suppress their feelings. And one of the interesting things to note that we're finding about dumpers already is that many of them actually have a rebound lined up before they break up with you. Now, what this might potentially mean is that the stages that we're talking about here can start as early as the tail end of your relationship with the dumper. Nevertheless, this stage encompasses the entirety of the rebound relationship from start to finish. So your ex-dumper enters into a rebound relationship with someone and they use that rebound relationship to repress their feelings. Maybe they're trying to lie to themselves or convince themselves that this is the person for them. This is the one. And then stage 4 hits after things don't work out so well with the rebound. And that's depression. Once again, I'm going to turn to freetoattach.com to help describe this stage. So the avoidant can have a depressive episode from 2 to 4 months after a breakup, manifested in feeling numb, disconnected, and meaningless, which they may try to repress. Now, everybody needs a deeper connection, but often avoidants don't recognize that they need partners until their partner actually loses interest in them and leaves through separation, divorce, death, illness, or something else. Then, when finally they realize nobody is in the house, that's when the crisis hits. It's then that a very deep depression can happen because they actually want connection and ultimately a safe, secure attachment like anybody else. And this is really the stage where they start to recognize what they've lost. But it's important to realize they frame it differently than you would expect. It's not, oh man, I'll never find another ex like them again. It's more along the lines of, why is this always happening to me? After all, when we're coming to relationship decisions, we're all kind of selfish a little bit. So they'll stay in the stage for a while before eventually falling victim to nostalgia. So one of my favorite videos is a video I did called How to Make an Avoidant Ex Miss You. And I filmed the entire thing to essentially explain the entire nostalgia stage. So one of the important things you need to remember about avoidant dumpers is they feel safest when they're alone or out of a relationship. There's nothing to threaten their independence if they aren't committed to someone. And so often what we find happening is they start to only focus on great moments of past loves. And usually this happens when 3 criteria are met. They moved on to someone else, you've moved on to someone else, or enough time has gone by. But here's an interesting twist. While they may fantasize about you, a pure avoidant dumper won't usually be the one to initiate. So Coach Tyler pointed out in one of our recent videos is that sometimes they can, but research often says you'll have to be the one to reach out first to an avoidant dumper. And there's one final thing that I'd like to talk about. So this is a personal addition to this video that may on the surface seems like it has nothing to do with a dumper hurting too. But in my opinion, it's where most of the confusion stems from, where most of the disconnect between you and what your ex is potentially going through is occurring. So when we have clients who are caught up in the confusion of a breakup, I think it stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of how dumpers often regulate their emotions. There's a time dilation factor at play. One of the most popular strategies that we definitely talk about is that of the no contact rule. So officially, our definition of the no contact rule refers to a period of time where you're cutting off all conceivable communication with an ex after a breakup. Now, the intent of this tactic should not be used to make your ex miss you, but instead should be used to rebuild your own life so that you outgrow your ex. Now, by doing this, the no contact rule can have that added benefit of making an ex miss you. Now, typically, we tell our clients to utilize it for 30 days. But what we found interesting is that attachment style theory can be a direct indicator on how much a person will struggle with the no contact rule. And it loops directly in with this time dilation factor. So for example, someone who has an anxious attachment style, someone who's very anxious by nature, for 30 days, that 30 days for them will feel like 60 days. For an avoidant attachment style, 30 days is going to feel like 15 days. And for a secure attachment style, 30 days feels like, well, 30 days. Now notice how avoidants often take longer to process things. And if this is true for something as simple as the no contact rule, then we can kind of assume that it also applies to all facets of post-breakup behavior. Generally speaking, the avoidant is going to take longer to process emotions as opposed to other attachment styles. Now, most of our clients are anxious by nature. So as you can imagine, the disconnect simply comes from the anxious individual thinking that the avoidant should be processing the breakup the same way they are. But that's not ever going to be the case. So let's answer the question, does the dumper hurt too? Well, in short, I think they do. Yes. But their grief is going to be different because if the dumper is an avoidant, they've come up with all these clever coping mechanisms on how to suppress their feeling. Think of it like a more agonizing process that on the outside might not look like they're grieving at all, but on the inside they really are. Now, it's important that you aren't placing your own ideals on how grief should work onto them. Instead, you should be spending all of your time doing one simple thing: finding something you care more about than them. Good things tend to happen for our clients who do just that.